With only 1 week left in the NFL regular season, there is still so much for teams to play for, from playoff position to draft position. This past week's games had excitement, intrigue, and even controversy. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. This is Sports Ball Network, and this is our NFL Week 17 breakdown. The final Thursday night football game of the NFL season saw the Cleveland Browns clinch a playoff spot with a 37-20 victory over the New York Jets. This game was really all Cleveland, particularly in the first half. Quarterback Joe Flacco continues his inspired play, 309 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. Jerome Ford on the ground, 64 yards. David Njoku led the way in receiving with 6 receptions for 134 yards. Really, Cleveland didn't need to do much in the second half, and they didn't do much in the second half because the game was over by halftime. This is a great Browns team. They're going to make a lot of noise in the playoffs. And although they can no longer get the number 1 seed due to Baltimore's victory, which we will be talking about later on, I fully expect them to be able to tango with any team in the AFC. The Jets, meanwhile, not really much to say here. Trevor Siemian got the start, 261 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Brees Hall, though, was a standout player. He had 84 yards on the ground. He also had 42 yards on 9 receptions for a touchdown. Garrett Wilson, 5 receptions, 50 yards. Really, though, the Jets were thoroughly dominated all game long. They could not really get anything going. And going into 2024, this team has a number of things that they're going to need to work on. They're going to need to work on their line. They're going to need to work on the defense. They're going to need to work on the scheme, both on the offense and the defensive side of the ball, if they want to compete. But with a healthy Aaron Rodgers coming back and with another year to improve, get more talent through the draft and through free agency, I expect the Jets to be competitive in 2024. And I expect them to potentially make the playoffs next year. Saturday night saw a titanic clash between the Detroit Lions and the Dallas Cowboys with a lot on the line. Detroit was playing for the number 1 seed, Dallas potentially playing for their divisional hopes. It was a good game. And up until the fourth quarter, it was a clean game. But I would be remiss if I did not mention the controversial call at the end of the game that resulted in the Cowboys winning this game 20-19. In case you do not know, the Lions lined up for a 2-point conversion after they scored to make the game 20-19. There would have been no time left. If they had converted, they would have won. And prior to the play, number 68 on the Lions offensive line reported as eligible. He did end up catching a pass on the 2-point conversion. The conversion succeeded. Detroit was set to win the game 21-20. However, a flag was thrown because number 68 was called for being an ineligible man downfield, despite the fact that he reported. There's video evidence he did. The referees say number 70 did. I don't know where that's coming from, but because of this call, Detroit had to attempt 2-point conversion for the win again. They did not. There was another penalty, another chance. Detroit did not convert, and they ended up losing 20-19, meaning that they are now out of the running for the number 1 seed. I don't really know where to start here. I guess we'll start with the Lions. Jared Goff, 271 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. He did not have a good game. David Montgomery, 65 yards, a touchdown on the ground. Amon-Ra, 6 receptions, 90 yards, a touchdown in the air. But that's not what people are going to be talking about in terms of the Lions for this game. A lot of people justifiably feel that the Lions were robbed. I personally believe that the call against Detroit was incorrect and that they likely should have won this game. But what's done is done. Now, because of the results of this game and because of the results of the Eagles-Cardinals game, Detroit is almost certainly locked into that number 3 seed. They don't really have much to play for here going into the final week of the season, and I would expect them to rest their starters. It's unfortunate, but things like this do galvanize teams on runs. And Detroit is a resilient, good football team. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with them down the stretch. Meanwhile, for Dallas, all penalties aside, they did end up winning this game. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they did enough to earn the win. Dak Prescott was great, 345 yards, 2 touchdowns, and interception. Tony Pollard continues a disappointing season. He had 49 yards on the ground. CeeDee Lamb, 227 yards and a touchdown on 13 receptions. He had a monster game. He's had an amazing season. He's really become one of the top 10 wide receivers in the league, in my opinion. It's going to be great to see him and Dak continue to grow and continue to develop their chemistry as the rest of this season and next season goes along. And for Dallas, this win was sorely needed. Going into this week, their chances to win the division were uncertain. They weren't great in a lot of people's opinions. The Eagles had a very easy schedule in the Cardinals and the Giants, and if they had won out, it would have been Philadelphia winning the division. But Dallas, with this win and with the Eagles' loss, is now in first place of the NFC East. And with a game against Washington next week, all Dallas needs to do is win, and they are the number 2 seed. The Baltimore Ravens dominated the Miami Dolphins in a 56-19 rout. They have clinched the AFC North and the number 1 seed now in the playoffs. The AFC will run through Baltimore. And really, there's not much for me to say about this Ravens team at this point that hasn't been said already. Lamar Jackson was fantastic. He's probably going to win the MVP at this point. 321 yards and 5 touchdowns in the air. He also had 35 yards on the ground. Gus Edwards, 68 yards and a touchdown on the ground as well. Zay Flowers, 3 receptions, 106 yards and a touchdown, though he is questionable with an injury to his calf. This Baltimore team is amazing. They are right now the class of the AFC, and I can't really envision a lot of teams beating them. Maybe Cleveland, maybe Buffalo with how they're playing right now. But just this is a great, great Ravens team. And personally, I would not be surprised if we see them hoisting that Lombardi trophy at the end of the year. Miami, meanwhile, is in a bit of a desperate situation. I've mentioned a couple times that there was a real chance Buffalo could still win the AFC East. Now that has pretty much come to fruition. Miami plays Buffalo next week, and at 11-5, if they lose to the 10-6 Buffalo Bills, they will lose the division. They will be forced into the wild card round. It's interesting. Miami is that team that is able to beat up on really bad teams all year, but when they actually face a good team, they end up floundering. If Miami does want to win the division, if they want to host a playoff game, they're going to have to bring their A game next week against a Buffalo team that is suddenly surging. Tua in this game, 237 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He was hot and cold. Devon Achane, 107 yards on the ground. Tyreek Hill, 6 receptions, 76 yards in the air. But overall, Miami did not do enough to win this game. And as a result, they are in a desperate, desperate situation going into the final week of the year. The Buffalo Bills did enough to dispatch the New England Patriots 27-21. Now at 10-6, have a chance to end up as the number 2 seed in the AFC, or they could miss the playoffs entirely. Well, let's talk about this game first. Josh Allen did not do a lot here, 169 yards and an interception in the air. However, on the ground, he had 44 yards and 2 touchdowns, so he made it up a little bit through his rushing ability. James Cook, 48 yards on the ground. Dalton Kincaid, the leading receiver, 4 receptions, 87 yards. Something else I want to note, Stephon Diggs, only 4 receptions for 26 yards. He has completely cooled off from the beginning of the season. It's shocking to see, but the reality is Stephon Diggs is not playing at a high level right now. And yet, despite that, Buffalo still manages to win games. New England, just a bad day at the office for them. Bailey Zappi, 209 yards and 3 interceptions in the air. Ezekiel Elliott, only 39 yards on the ground, though he did have a touchdown. The leading receiver was Kevin Harris, 2 receptions for 54 yards. Just a terrible, terrible day for them. This game was important for both teams. Let's talk about Buffalo first. Buffalo now, I mentioned earlier, has a chance to be the number 2 seed in the AFC with a victory over Miami. In that case, they would take the division over the Dolphins. However, if they lose next week, they could end up missing the playoffs despite being a 10-7 team due to tiebreakers. So next week really is do or die for Buffalo. But the only reason they are even at this point is because they won this game. Meanwhile, for New England, they are now in position for a top 3 draft pick and one of the blue chip quarterback prospects in Bo Nix, Drake May, Caleb Williams, or Michael Penix. They're in fantastic position to rebuild their roster. And next week, if they lose, they could potentially jump to the number 2 pick if certain things happen or if Washington wins. But overall, this outcome is probably for the best for both teams. Buffalo's trying to compete, New England's trying to rebuild. And now it sets up a very, very interesting week 18 for not only Buffalo, but New England as well. The Atlanta Falcons, surprise, surprise, lost to the Chicago Bears in a 37-17 rout that saw Atlanta do almost nothing on offense. Taylor Heinicke, 163 yards, a touchdown, and 3 interceptions through the air. Bijan Robinson, 75 yards on the ground. Tyler Algier was the leading receiver with 1 reception for 75 yards that went for a touchdown. I've talked at length about Atlanta's problems. I've talked at length about their coaching staff, about their offensive scheme, about how it's not working, and how they stubbornly refuse to give any of their good players the football. I don't know what to say at this point. It's looking increasingly likely that Atlanta's retaining Arthur Smith and his staff for 2024. I don't know why, but they are. And yeah, at this point, this is what this Atlanta Falcons team is. They're not good. They're going to lose these types of games, and they're going to continue to lose these types of games so long as they keep doing the same thing over and over again. Despite that, though, they do still have a chance to win the division, make the playoffs if they win the final week and get some help. But I would not hang my hat on that if I were an Atlanta Falcons fan. Let's talk about Chicago as well. Justin Fields is making a case for the Bears not to take a quarterback in this year's draft with the number 1 overall pick that they have secured. He threw for 268 yards and a touchdown. In addition, he also added 45 yards and a touchdown on the ground. He was dynamic. He looked great. Khalil Herbert, 124 yards and a touchdown on the ground. He also looked great. However, he does have an injury. He was limited in practice this week with a back injury, something to monitor here. And DJ Moore, 9 receptions, 159 yards, and a touchdown. He was fantastic as well, and he has a real connection with Justin Fields. Going to be very interesting to see what the Bears do, but they do have the number 1 overall pick. They have their own pick as well. And this team looks to be in really good shape come 2024. They're going to be able to add a lot of young talent. They're going to be able to bring in some free agents. And if things go right, hopefully they'll be able to compete for the playoffs. The Houston Texans at 9-7, following their 26-3 victory over the Tennessee Titans, are still very much alive in the playoff picture and now have a do or die date with the Indianapolis Colts in week 18 to determine which team is going to end up making that final wildcard spot in the AFC. Uh, let's talk about Houston first. CJ Stroud continues a fantastic rookie season, 213 yards and a touchdown in the air. Devin Singletary complimented him well on the ground, 80 yards on 16 carries. Nico Collins led the receiving room, 7 receptions, 80 yards. The defense contributed a fumble return for a touchdown. And really, this Texans team is just playing with a lot of energy, which full credit to Coach D'Amico Ryans, who absolutely should be one of the favorites for the Coach of the Year award. Uh, Houston uh, does have a chance to make the playoffs if they beat the Colts next week, which is not something anyone thought they would have been saying at the beginning of the year. But this team is young, they're good, they have a lot of energy, and they absolutely are in a fantastic spot no matter what happens next week. For the Titans, it's not great where they're at right now. They have an older roster that's kind of transitioning a little bit. Ryan Tannehill got the start due to rookie Will Levis having injury. He threw for 168 yards. Derrick Henry ran for 42. I would not be surprised if he's gone after the season. DeAndre Hopkins, 7 receptions, 72 yards. He's, again, one of those older guys on this roster. He might end up being a casualty as well following the season. But really, Tennessee, they're just one of those teams that right now do not have a lot in terms of youth or firepower. That's why they're 5-11 after a season in which they were competing for the division last year. And this roster is just going to have to go through a lot of transition over the next couple of years in order for this team to really be competitive once more. But with Coach Mike Vrabel at the helm, I don't doubt that they'll be able to get through that. The Indianapolis Colts, in their 23-20 victory over the Raiders, not only extinguished Las Vegas's playoff hopes, but ensured that they set themselves up on a do or die date with the Houston Texans in Week 18 to determine which team would make the playoffs out of those two. The Colts did just enough to win this game. Gardner Minshew, 224 yards and a touchdown in the air. Jonathan Taylor, 96 yards and a touchdown on the ground. Alec Pierce led the wide receiver room, a single reception for 58 yards and a touchdown, which is notable because Michael Pittman was playing after that pretty bad concussion he suffered. He had 5 receptions for 46 yards. On the Raiders side, rookie Aiden O'Connell continued to impress. 299 yards, 2 touchdowns. Zamir White added another 71 yards on the ground. Devontae Adams, 13 receptions, 126 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He was fantastic. But overall, this game was not great for the Raiders. They ended up being eliminated from playoff contention. That being said, Coach Antonio Pierce has really turned this culture around and this team around. This team is competing. They're fighting down the stretch. And as a result, I think he's going to be coming back as their coach in 2024. And they could end up, if things go right, being really competitive once more in an AFC West that suddenly looks really, really vulnerable. Meanwhile, for Indianapolis, I mentioned before, they do have that do or die date with the Houston Texans. Everything's on the line here. If Indy loses next week, they're out of the playoffs. If they win, they're in the playoffs and potentially could win their division depending on what happens with the Jacksonville game. So they're going to have to bring their A game next week against Houston if they want to continue playing well into January. The Jacksonville Jaguars, after having a little bit of a slide the past few weeks, finally got back into the win column with a 26-0 victory over the hapless Carolina Panthers. For Jacksonville, this was expected, even with quarterback Trevor Lawrence out. Quarterback CJ Beathard filling in had 178 yards in the air. He did not really need to do much because Travis Etienne had 102 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. Evan Ingram, the tight end, led the receiving room with 6 receptions for 60 yards. The defense just thoroughly dominated Carolina all game long, which was expected. This Carolina Panthers team is terrible. And as a result, Jacksonville still holds on to their division lead. They have a chance to clinch the division next week with a game with the Tennessee Titans. If they win, they are the winner of the AFC South. They are in the playoffs. If they lose, however, they could be at risk because then the winner of the Colts Texans game would end up winning the division, securing that playoff spot. Uh, Miami and Buffalo would almost certainly make the playoffs if Jacksonville loses. Cleveland has clinched, and depending on tiebreakers, Jacksonville could find themselves on the outside looking in. So they still need to keep it up, and they still need to give it everything they have next week if they want to make the playoffs. Carolina, where do we start here? Let's start with owner David Tepper, who dumped his drink on a fan's head. This is absolutely unacceptable behavior for him. He was fined $300,000, issued a public apology, but still absolutely unacceptable. He absolutely should be getting punished more for this than what he has been so far. I wouldn't be surprised if he's asked at some point to maybe step away from NFL games for a little bit. But that summed up the Panthers season perfectly. It's just been a mess. They haven't been able to do anything, and as a result, it's just frustration all around. Rookie quarterback Bryce Young, 112 yards and an interception. There are a number of questions he's going to have to answer going into next season in order to prove that he belongs in the NFL as a starter, especially given that fellow rookie CJ Stroud has been amazing. Chuba Hubbard led the way on the ground with 45 yards. Adam Thielen, 6 receptions for 38 yards, leading the wide receiver room. Just this team is terrible. They don't even have their own draft pick. They're just a mess right now. And given how ownership has behaved, how they're acting, given the talent on the roster, and given the lack of capital to improve the talent on said roster, I wouldn't be surprised if 2024 gives us more of the same dumpster fire that we have watched this year. After last year's Super Bowl slump, the Los Angeles Rams once again punched their playoff ticket with a 26-25 victory over the New York Giants. Quarterback Matthew Stafford was pretty good in this game for the most part. He had 317 yards, touchdown. He did have 2 interceptions, but overall, good day for him. Kyren Williams, 3 touchdowns on the ground, 87 yards on the ground as well. He was absolutely fantastic. What a great season from him. He's going to be a key player for this team moving forward. Puka Nacua, 5 receptions, 118 yards. Great standout performance by him as well. This Rams team is very exciting. They're young, they have a lot of energy, and they could be a tough playoff out. Personally, I'm excited to see what they're able to do in January, starting with a likely date, Detroit Lions. Meanwhile, for the New York Giants, they fall to 5-11. Their season is over. Tyrod Taylor got the start here, 319 yards, touchdown, and an interception. Tyrod Taylor also led the team in rushing, 6 carries for 40 yards. Saquon Barkley, meanwhile, only managed 39 yards on 12 carries. For receiving, it was Darius Slayton leading the way, 4 receptions for 106 yards and a touchdown. This Giants team was in the middle of a rebuild last year before they unexpectedly made the playoffs. This year, the expectations were a little bit higher. Maybe they should not have been, considering there were quite a few deficits on the roster, which have shown up now. Going into the offseason, it's going to be very interesting to see what New York does in terms of their quarterback situation. Daniel Jones obviously still has that contract of his. The out is not until the end of next year, so he is likely on the books for 2024. They have Tyrod Taylor, Tommy DeVito. I imagine that they might want to bring in another rookie as well. We'll see. But 2024 is going to be another year in which these Giants end up continuing to try and build themselves up so that way they can be competitive in the NFC in the future. The Philadelphia Eagles lost this game to the Arizona Cardinals, 35-31. As you guys may or may not know from the past videos, I do root for the Philadelphia Eagles, and the only thing I can say is that results like this are not acceptable. Results like this are going to give the Eagles a very disappointing playoff run. Results like this are why the Eagles are likely going to lose the NFC East to the Dallas Cowboys. Uh, on the day, Jalen Hurts was 167 yards and 3 touchdowns with an interception in the air, but he seemed off, especially in the latter half of the game. DeAndre Swift ran for 61 yards. A.J. Brown led the team in receiving, 4 receptions, 53 yards. The defense was not able to do much. They did have a pick six in the first half, but outside of that, really nothing. They weren't able to stop an Arizona Cardinals team that is 4-12. That really says all that you need to know about this team. Philadelphia at this point looks to be completely fraudulent, and I would not be surprised at all if they end up losing in the playoffs, possibly in Wild Card Weekend to the NFC South winner, which is perhaps the most disappointing thing I can think of for this team. So, of course, it will happen. Meanwhile, for the Arizona Cardinals, Kyler Murray, 232 yards, 3 touchdowns, an interception. He also added 24 yards on the ground. This was the first game where Kyler really looked like the Kyler of the past couple of years, so it was really good to see that. Gives him a lot of momentum going into next year. James Conner, fantastic game, 128 yards and a touchdown. Greg Dortch, the leading receiver, 7 receptions, 82 yards. Uh, Arizona's defense was able to do enough to stop Philadelphia in the second half, where the Eagles were not really able to get anything going. Just, man, the Eagles are so bad right now. It's honestly shocking. But that's besides the point. Cardinals played a really good game. They obviously deserve the win, and they were giving themselves a lot of great momentum going into 2024, where they are going to look to continue to establish a winning culture under head coach Jonathan Gannon. The New Orleans Saints ended up getting a much needed victory over division rival Tampa Bay in order to not only keep their division hopes alive, but their wild card hopes alive as well. New Orleans ended up beating Tampa 23-13, and with a game against the Atlanta Falcons next week, they have a real chance to end the season with a 9-8 winning record. That could be enough for the final seed in the NFC. Derek Carr, 197 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jamal Williams led the team in rushing with 58 yards because Alvin Kamara suffered an injury to his ankle in the game. The leading receiver, Jawan Johnson, at the tight end position, 8 receptions, 90 yards, and a touchdown. He had a fantastic game. Chris Olave also injured with an ankle injury. He had 3 receptions for 26 yards. The defense forced a fumble. They also had a couple sacks here. And really, this was a game that New Orleans desperately, desperately needed. And because they won, they are going to have a lot to play for next week. Tampa Bay, meanwhile, although they lost this game, is still in a pretty good spot. They are in first place in this division. They have the tiebreaker over New Orleans, and they play the Carolina Panthers next week. So as long as they win that game, they will win their division. They'll make the playoffs as the 4 seed, and they'll be able to host the second place team of the NFC East, which now looks to be the Philadelphia Eagles. Tampa, though, going into the playoffs, cannot play like this. They were inconsistent. Nothing really worked. Baker, for example, 309 yards, 2 touchdowns, but also 2 interceptions and several crucial mistakes. He is limited now with the rib injury as well, something to monitor. The team has to start Kyle Trask. Rashad White, 42 yards on the ground. He was not able to get much going. Rookie Trey Palmer led the team in receiving, 4 receptions, 84 yards, and a touchdown. Both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin are going to need to step up going into the playoffs. But still, Tampa looks to be in a good spot. They have a decent team, a decent roster, and as long as they're able to take care of business against Carolina next week, they will end up winning the NFC South. The afternoon kicked off with San Francisco taking on the Washington Commanders. and it was San Francisco who ended up winning this game, much to everyone's expectations, 27 to 10. San Francisco has now clinched the number one seed in the NFC due to tiebreakers and because they have that 12th win now. Brock Purdy, 230 yards, 2 touchdowns, a nice bounce back game from him. Christian McCaffrey is hurt. He has a strained calf. I believe he is going to be out next week, getting some rest, but it's not a long term thing. Elijah Mitchell in his place ran for 80 yards and a touchdown. Brandon Ayuk caught 7 balls for 114 yards and a touchdown. Debo also added in 5 receptions, 37 yards and a touchdown. Kittle, 3 receptions, 29 yards. The defense chipped in with a sack, 2 interceptions. And San Francisco at this point probably going to rest all their starters. They get that extra week of rest before the division round. And because of that rest, coupled with just the sheer talent on this team, I wouldn't be surprised if they're able to run through the NFC playoff bracket come January and punch their ticket to the Super Bowl in February. Washington, meanwhile, falls to 4-12. They are now in position for the number 2 overall pick, where they are expected to take a quarterback. Speaking of quarterbacks, Sam Howell was not bad, all things considered, in this game. 169 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Really, he's had an up and down season, but he's likely exceeded expectations in terms of what people thought he was going to be coming into the NFL. I would not be surprised if he gets another chance next year, whether it's with this team or another one. Brian Robinson, 44 yards on the ground. Terry McLaurin, 4 receptions, 61 yards and a touchdown. Washington just has a lot of needs, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. Their offensive line could use some work. They've given up a ton of sacks this year. Quarterback position could be upgraded, and really it's going to be very interesting to see what Washington does in the offseason to start to address the holes on their roster so they are back on the path towards competitiveness. Mike Tomlin does it again. He finishes the season with a winning record. And that is because the Pittsburgh Steelers ended up beating the Seattle Seahawks 30 to 23 to move to 9-7 on the season. The worst Pittsburgh can finish now is 9-8, so they have clinched the winning record. Mike Tomlin's record stays safe. Mason Rudolph started this game for Pittsburgh. He'll start next week's game too, in what is shaping up to be a very interesting quarterback controversy. He threw for 274 yards on the day. Najee Harris, 122 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. This new offensive system seems to have worked wonders for him. George Pickens, 7 receptions, 131 yards. He's getting hot as well. And who knows? Pittsburgh wins on Sunday against the Baltimore Ravens, who are likely to be sitting a lot of their starters, get a little bit of help, and they could be right back in the playoffs, which is shocking to say. Seattle, meanwhile, fell to 8-8. Geno Smith, 290 yards and a touchdown in the air. Kenneth Walker, 53 and a touchdown on the ground, but he's questionable with a shoulder injury. DK Metcalf, 5 receptions, 106 yards. Seattle really, really needs to win next week. They also need the Packers to lose next week in order to make the playoffs. Otherwise, they'll be heading into the offseason with a number of questions on this roster, particularly at quarterback. And right now, not a lot of answers. Going to be very, very interesting to see what happens week 18 and how things shake out for them. The Denver Broncos surprisingly started the week by announcing a quarterback change as they benched quarterback Russell Wilson for Jarrett Stidham. But despite the quarterback change, they ended the week with a not so surprising victory over the floundering Los Angeles Chargers, with a 16-19 game. Jarrett Stidham, for his part, actually looked pretty good. 224 yards and a touchdown in the air. Joel McLaughlin led the team on the ground, 8 carries for 44 yards. For what it's worth, Javonte Williams added in another 41 yards. The receiver corps was led by Lil Jordan Humphrey, 2 receptions for 69 yards and a touchdown. The receivers also were led by Jerry Jeudy, who had 3 receptions for 54 yards. Unfortunately, though, Cortland Sutton was out for this game. Denver needed this win in order to kind of confirm to themselves that they were making the right decision by benching Russ. They needed this win for Sean Payton, who really wants to establish his culture now. And they really needed this win to see what they had on the roster going into the 2024 offseason, where they most certainly will be making sweeping changes, likely cutting the guy that was their starting quarterback for most of the year. The Chargers, meanwhile, continue to struggle. Easton Stick threw for 220 yards. Austin Eckler ran for 46. It was the 31-year-old Alec Erickson who led the receivers, 7 receptions for 98 yards. Really, we know what are at this point. They are a team in transition. They have all the talent in the world, but they're never able to put it together. And now, going into the offseason, they are once again going to have to find a coach and a GM who are able to maximize the talent on this roster and get this team back on the winning track. With their 25-17 victory over the Cincinnati Bengals, the Kansas City Chiefs were able to clinch the AFC West once more. Kansas City is almost certainly locked into that number 3 seed. If Miami ends up losing, Buffalo ends up winning their division. Buffalo beat Kansas City earlier. They have that tiebreaker. Meanwhile, will likely have the tiebreaker over whatever team wins the AFC South. So it's not really surprising to see Kansas City announce going into next Sunday's game that they are going to be sitting their starters. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the Chiefs come playoff time. If Kansas City wins their wild card weekend matchup, it will be the first time that Patrick Mahomes will ever have to play a road playoff game. Speaking of Mahomes, he had 245 yards and a touchdown in this game. Isaiah Pacheco was fantastic on the ground, 18 carries, 130 yards. He also had an impact in the receiving game, 35 yards on 7 receptions for a touchdown. This was just a big Isaiah Pacheco game. Rashee Rice led the receiver corps, 5 receptions, 127 yards. He's been fantastic as of late. Travis Kelce, though, had a quiet day, 3 receptions, 15 yards. Going to be very interesting to see what happens with him in the offseason and with retirement potentially looming. But ultimately, that doesn't matter right now. What does is that Kansas City once again won their division, and now they are in the playoffs, hoping to repeat their 2022 success. Cincinnati, meanwhile, had a relatively lackluster day all around. Jake Browning, 197 yards and a touchdown. Joe Mixon, 65 yards on the ground. Jamar Chase, 41 yards on 3 receptions. And because of this loss, Cincinnati has been eliminated from the AFC playoff picture. And as a result, they are going to have to now focus on an offseason where they are going to have to manage their cap in order to retain a lot of their talent and bring in new stars in order to compete in a tough AFC North division. Sunday night football saw the Green Bay Packers steamroll the Minnesota Vikings in order to claim the final playoff spot as of now in the NFC. Green Bay won 33-10 and were led by quarterback Jordan Love, who has really come into his own. 256 yards and 3 touchdowns from the signal caller through the air. Aaron Jones, 120 yards on the ground. He was great. The leading receiver, Bo Melton, 105 yards and a touchdown on 6 receptions. This Green Bay team is young. We've talked about this before, but that doesn't mean that they're not able to succeed where the lights are brightest. And clearly, they demonstrated that. As a result, they are now in position for the final playoff spot in the NFC. And so long as they beat the Chicago Bears, a team which, as of late, they have dominated, they should end up making the playoffs as a 7th seed. How about that? Minnesota, meanwhile, falls to 7-9. They would need a lot of help to make the playoffs at this point. And at this point, with the team rolling with Nick Mullins as the starter, given the number of injuries that the team has, that seems unlikely. Mullins threw for 113 yards and a touchdown. Ty Chandler on the ground, 10 carries, 40 yards. Justin Jefferson, 5 receptions, 59 yards. At this point, Minnesota just seems too hurt. They don't have enough firepower, and it'd be a surprise if they make the NFC playoffs this year. That being said, there's still a chance, but more likely than not, they should start to turn their focus towards 2024. Thank you so much for watching this week's NFL breakdown. If you liked what you saw, please leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll catch you in the next one.